Hi everyone! In this video of Accelerated Chess Dragon, we're going to be looking at another chess opening, and this is the Caro Kann defense and the exchange variation. So without further ado, let's look at this. White will start off by playing e4 and black will play c6. So the Caro Kann defense, d4 by white, d5 by black, and white could usually play the move knight to c3, knight to d2, e5, maybe even f3, but in this specific variation, white is going to play e takes d5, exchanging the pawns on the d5 square. And here, white will play the move bishop d3. And this move guards the threat of bishop to f5 from black, and this is usually what black wants to achieve. Black wants to develop his bishop outside of the pawn chain, and after that, he will play the move e6, and essentially, you have brought your bishop outside the pawn chain, and now you just have solid central pawns. And why does black do this? Because usually this bishop on c8 will tend to be a very difficult piece for black to deal with, so black is going to develop the bishop first, and then only play e6 and get a solid pawn chain. Because black cannot play bishop f5 in this variation, black plays knight c6, and now white defends with c3. And here, black has three moves: knight f6, queen c7, and g6. We're going to be looking at queen c7 first, and if this move is played, then white will just play knight e2. Black will play bishop g4, and now f3 from white, kicking the bishop back. The bishop goes to d7, and now bishop to f4. So white's developing all of his pieces, and he's gaining an attack towards the queen on c7. e5, de5, knight e5, and now bishop c2. Preserving the bishop, as otherwise black would play knight takes d3, and even though black would end up with an isolated pawn on the d5 square, it could still be useful later on in the game. So bishop c2 and bishop d6 from black, defending the knight on e5 and reinforcing it in case there are ever ideas of an attack towards it. And here, there's an interesting variation. Why doesn't white just play the move queen takes d5? Well, if white does this, then black is going to play knight f6, developing and attacking the queen. And now what happens if you play a move like queen to d4? Well, in that case, white is just going to be met with castles, and even though black is down a pawn, the amount of positional advantage he has is quite good. And if white castles in this position just to get away from all of this, you would just run into bishop c5 and you've lost your queen. So there's not really much way to defend against this. And if you play something like knight d2 after just a simple rook f8, if you look at the development of white's pieces, they're not really developed well, and if you compare it to black's pieces, you'll notice a huge difference. So queen takes d5 is not the best idea. Instead, bishop to a4, attacking the bishop on d7 and hopefully trying to get some exchanges on the board. Black plays bishop c6, and now white goes castles. And after knight e7, knight d4, black is usually said to be slightly worse, considering that he would maybe have to trade the bishops off the board. But in general, it's a very equal position, and both sides have great opportunities. Instead of playing queen c7, you could have also went for g6, as black, which just tries to fiend shadow this bishop. White will play knight f3, and now black will play the move knight h6. Knight h6 is always trying to aim this knight at the very nice f5 square, and from there, the knight is very nicely centralized. White castles, and now bishop to g7 is one move, and bishop f5 is another. Knight h6 can either be used to put the knight on f5, or it could be used to defend maybe another piece going to f5. In this case, it's the bishop. After bishop f5 is played, white plays rook e1, black captures the bishop, and we get a trade, bishop g7, and now bishop f4 by white. White is developing his bishop and getting ready to play knight bd2. Knight f5, and after knight bd2, the position should be slightly equal for both sides, but maybe it could be slightly better for white. White has more development compared to black. White's even castled, and it'll take a bit of time before black can actually get an equal position compared to white. The other move that you could try instead of playing bishop to f5 is bishop g7. And if this move is played, then rook e1 by white, castles by black, and now bishop f4. Even though you could capture the knight on h6, it's better to just avoid it because you would give up the bishop pair. f6, and now you cannot play the move queen d2 and attack the knight again because the knight would go to f7. So c4, trying to exchange some pawns and maybe get some nice central pieces. Bishop g4, pinning the knight, cd5, and now knight d4. You could capture on d5, but capturing on d4 and pinning this knight on f3 is also an option. And here, white will play bishop c4. And white should usually be thought of as better because white, even though he's pinned to his queen, white has opportunities such as playing the move d6 check, and with attacks towards maybe this e7 pawn, it's a lot easier for white, and white is a lot more flexible in positions like this. So that was the move g6. Now there's one more move that black can play, and that's knight to f6. If knight f6 is played, then white will play bishop f4, developing his bishop. And here black has three moves: bishop g4, g6, and e6. If e6 is played, then knight f3 by white, bishop to d6 by black, a trade of bishops, and now both sides castle, and queen e2. Bishop to d7, knight bd2, and after rook fe8, white prevents black from pushing e5 by playing knight e5. And this is a very good move because you do not want black to play e5 and activate his light squared bishop, which at the moment isn't very active. So after knight e5, black could maybe play something like rook a8 and centralize his rook. And then on white's end, white could try f4 and just centralize the knight. Both sides have quite solid positions, so it's an okay position here. Black could also play g6 instead of going e6, and this would allow knight d2, bishop g7, knight gf3, castles by black, and now h3. And here, black plays an interesting move, and if you're not really familiar to most Caro Kann positions, then you might think of this move as a bit dubious. Black plays the move bishop f5, and at first you might think, why would black just want to double his pawns like that? And indeed, this move isn't really that useful in many cases because it doubles the pawns, but it is useful because it does get a very strong grip towards this e4 square. And usually, this knight on f6 is going to enter into e4, and it'll be very useful for that knight having an extra supporter, not just on d5. But usually, in this position, white will play g4, and he's trying to create an attack. This already signals that if white is going to castle, it's most likely going to be queenside, and white is trying to attack black from the king side. So queen d7, queen c2, and now knight e4. You might be wondering why not f takes g4, but this is pretty self-explanatory. After h takes g4, white is already way better. So knight e4 and now knight h4. Threatening the f5 pawn, we have a trade of knights on d2, and after this, white would be better considering that he has a stronger attack that is coming up, and black is okay. If he just defends well, then it could be fine for him. And that is g6. Now, the last move that we can look at is bishop to g4. And here, white can play the move queen b3, and black has three moves yet again. Queen c8, queen d7, and knight a5. If knight a5 is played, then white plays queen i4 check, black brings the bishop back to d7. You cannot really play the move queen d7 because you lose the knight on a5, and if you go for knight d7, then white has the option of just playing the move knight d2 and developing. But you should just note that you should never play the move queen d7 as it just blunders the piece. So bishop d7 and now queen c2. And after e6, we've noticed that now this bishop has gotten into a very passive position. Even though it is developed, it is blocked by all of these pawns on light squares, and it's really hard for it to get out now. And if you remember from the Grand Prix attack in the Sicilian, which I made a video on, it's kind of similar to that. White will lose a tempo just to get the bishop into a very bad position. And it's very similar to the Caro Kann. You've lost a tempo with the queen, but if you consider that this bishop is a very bad piece here, you might think it's not so bad doing this. So white will play knight f3, black will play queen b6, and now a4 by white. And here, white is just trying to stop the idea of bishop b5, and that's the reason why a4 was played. And here you might be wondering, why doesn't black just play the move knight b3? Well, it's because white is just going to play rook a2. And even though the rook is awkwardly placed, this knight must move sometime in the future. And after that, let's say it moves right now, b4 by white, and white has gotten a very nice queenside expansion. And white should definitely stand better, considering that he has a lot more space than black, and that black is very restricted in his piece activity. So we have rook c8 instead, and now knight bd2, preventing knight b3, knight c6, and queen b1. You cannot just castle like that, because after knight to b4 by black, you just lose the bishop pair. And after that, it's not really the same position, because you've lost the bishop pair, and after something like queen takes b2, for instance, black would definitely stand better, considering that he has the bishop pair. This bishop is able to be activated a lot easier than in previous variations, and you could just say that black has a very, very good advantage. So castles isn't an option, so instead queen b1, and after this, both sides have an equal position. The other move that you could play instead of knight a5 is queen d7. And if queen d7 is played, then knight d2, e6, knight gf3, normal development. And here, black trades his bishop for the knight on f3 and plays bishop d6. So black managed to get his bishop out of the pawn chain, traded for a knight on f3, and now he's willing to trade more pieces off. And bishop g3 by white. You might be wondering, why doesn't white just capture the bishop on d6 and just trade and just win a pawn like that? And the reason is because even though you do technically win a pawn, after queen a6, rook to b6, queen a4 could be played, and now castles by black. Even though white is up a pawn, it doesn't really seem like there's much use for it. White doesn't really seem like he has much counterplay. Meanwhile, black is trying to get moves like rook takes b2 in, which would get the pawn back, but also get a significant amount of counterplay for black. So black would definitely stand better if you are willing to trade bishops like that. So bishop g3, offering the trade on white's terms. Black castles, white castles, bishop g3, hg3, and now rook a b8. Reinforcing the b7 pawn in case this queen ever has to move. Rook a e1, and now a6, which weakens the b6 square, but white is never going to use that square. So queen d1, trying to transfer the queen over, b5 and g4. And this is a very nice idea, and it forces either g6 by black or h6 by black. Unfortunately, you cannot play the move knight takes g4 because this allows bishop takes h7 check. And if you are willing to capture this bishop on h7, then white plays knight g5 check. King goes to maybe g6, and now queen takes g4. And after this, white has equal material, true, but there is a very big problem with black's position, and his king is very, very vulnerable to lots of attacks. So knight g4 is just simply not an option. Instead, you can play either g6 or h6. If h6 is played, then g5, which trades some pawns off. And you must capture if you do not want to open up the position to your king. So hg5, knight g5, and now b4. So black is trying to get some counterplay on the queen side, whereas white is trying to attack on the king side. So rook e3, we have a trade on c3, and now rook b2. Threatening the a2 pawn, although in this particular case, it's not a really good idea to capture it, considering the position of your king. So rook h3, and white would definitely get a good attack from here on. You could also try g6, but this leads to a very, very nice variation that becomes quite tactical. g5, saving the pawn and also attacking the knight, forcing it to go back, and now g3. And the simple idea is just to play king g2, rook h1, rook h6, bring the other rook over, maybe then bring it to somewhere like h2, and then finally bring this queen over. Something like that, just to get a lot of pressure towards this h7 pawn, and in general, this h file. So, knight c7. Black tries to maybe free up some space for his king, and hopes to do something with this. Unfortunately, this knight c7 move doesn't do anything to contribute to the fact that black is getting attacked on the king side. So, king g2, b4, rook h1, and now we do have a trade of pawns again, and after rook b2, rook h6. King g7, rook eh1, threatening the h7 pawn, so you don't have time to grab the a2 pawn. Rook h8, queen c1, and now rook takes a2. But this was all a trap. In fact, the best move for black was actually to just give up the rook on b2 for the better of the position. Unfortunately, if black is willing to capture the pawn on a2, then he's already lost. Queen to b1 by white, and there's actually no defense to the threat that white has. Black decides to play rook a3, and he thinks that he's safe. I mean, he just grabbed the pawn, and after something like rook takes c3, maybe grabbing another pawn, or maybe just rook a5, knight b5, consolidating some way or another, black should be better, right? Well, not exactly, because this crushing blow just ends the game for white. Can you find out what it is? Okay, so white can just play the move bishop g6, and this is a very nice combination, because after f takes g6, most players would think that there's nothing here. I mean, you just sacrificed a piece, and how do you really break through? Well, you sacrifice the queen. Queen takes g6 check. And now this forces a very unfavorable variation for black. Now, if you play the move king to f8, which is the only other move other than accepting this queen, then after queen f6 check, you're lost. If you do not defend this rook with something like king g8, then you're obviously going to lose it. But if you do defend it, then after rook g6 check, you're lost as black. You must capture the rook, and now rook takes h8 is checkmate, so that's it. And there's really nothing else if you're going to decline the queen. So you must accept the queen, but now rook takes h8, and there's simply no way of defending against this threat. Rook 1 to h7 checkmate. It doesn't matter what you do, whether it's capturing this pawn, capturing this, you are going to get checkmated on the next move. That is where the move queen d7 has its faults. Now, there is also one other move, which is queen to c8. This also defends the b7 pawn. And here, white will play knight d2, black will play the move e6, and now knight gf3 by white. Bishop e7, both sides castle, knight e5, attacking the bishop on g4. And here, black has two moves, bishop h5 or knight takes e5. And if knight takes e5 is played, then d takes e5 by white, knight d7, queen c2, threatening the h7 pawn. And here, black has two moves again, h6 and g6. If g6 is played, then h3, bishop f5, a trade of bishops. And now after knight f3, white has a very good advantage, and that is the very, very weak position of black's pawns on the king side. And white will definitely use this to his advantage, and white would just be better in this position. In the case of h6, white will play the move h3, bishop h5 by black, g4 by white, bishop g6, and this seems to lose a pawn, but you cannot capture the pawn on g6 because there's rook takes f4. So bishop h6. What is this move trying to do? Well, if you capture this bishop on h6, then after queen takes g6 check, king to h8, queen takes h6 check, king to g8, queen takes e6 check, and now if you try to defend with the move rook to f7, then there's just simply moves like knight to b3 or even queen takes d5, and black is completely lost. There's no way to defend against a lot of all these threats, and e6 is the biggest of all of them. So that is why it's not a good idea to capture the bishop, and why black will play knight takes e5, which defends the g6 pawn, but now also threatens to capture on h6. Bishop e3 by white, g5 by black, and now rook a to e1. Centralizing the rook, and also getting ready for a mass attack. Knight c6, king g2, and now e5. Black is trying to do as much as he can by pushing these pawns, and maybe trying to get some counterplay towards this bishop on e3, but he's just too slow. Knight f3, e4, and now knight d4. And here, black could trade the knights on d4, but that would only improve the position of white's bishop. So knight e5, and now f3. And the point of this is that after all of the trades, white is definitely going to be better. So knight takes f3, and if you even think about trading all of the pieces, let's say rook f3, knight f3, and now king takes f3, check on f8, and now king g2. White would definitely stand better because his bishop on e3 will go to d4 and it'll be really centralized, and it's really hard for black to play much else. So that means that after the move f3, the position is relatively equal for both sides, and that also means that knight takes e5 has its faults. And that is the end of the knight takes e5 move. There's still one more move, which is bishop to h5, but that allows rook ae1, centralizing the rook, knight e5 by black, bishop e5 by white, bishop g6, a trade of bishops, and now queen d1. And the idea is to assist in the attack towards the black king. b5, rook e3, a5, and now h4, trying to push the pawn to h5 where it would severely weaken the king's side structure. b4, and now rook h3, queen a6, h5, knight takes h5. This h5 move is actually a very common sacrifice if you've ever played the exchange Caro Kann in this variation, and it's a very good thing to note that you should be very careful in a position like this, because one wrong move can turn the tables very quickly. So knight takes h5, and now queen g4 by white. The threat is rook takes h5, and after g takes h5, just queen takes g7, and that would be checkmate. So what does black do? Black plays bishop f6. Bishop takes f6, knight takes f6, queen h4 by white, and after knight h5, white plays g4. And now the knight, if it moves, will give black a checkmate on h8, and if the knight doesn't move, then you simply just win it by playing g takes h5, and white is completely winning after that. So after g4 is played, that is the end of the variation, and I hope you all enjoyed the video, and if you have any suggestions or feedback for me, please let me know in the comment section, and stay tuned for more chess.